Welcome to the video tutorial playlist for the content assessment on biodiversity in humans. This is designed to help students in middle school science pass the content assessment in the Summit platform. But if you don't have it, if you don't use Summit, it can still be useful if you're trying to learn about things like what is biodiversity, what are the different types of biodiversity, how we measure them, and how it affects humans. Why is it important for us to preserve it, and in what ways does it hurt us when we don't? So the first objective, which is what this video is going to be focusing on, is the idea of the different types of diversity. There are so many biomes across our planet, right? So we have a biosphere, which can be broken down into many different biomes. And each of these biomes shows up because of specific variations in the amounts of nutrients, but especially in the temperature and precipitation that is in the place. Like if you have a really hot place with a lot of water, of course you have a tropical rainforest. But if you start taking away water, it becomes a dry forest, a savanna, and then even a desert. Now, if you are colder and with a lot of water, notice you're not going to have as much water as you would in a very hot place because you're not going to get as much precipitation where it's not warm. But water can still come because of rain, and some evaporation will happen in temperate areas. You're going to get a temperate rainforest, like the ones you see in the northwest of the United States of America, in Oregon, Northern California, Washington State. And that's still a luscious rainforest because of a constant amount of rain, even though it's in a temperate area. But of course, that doesn't compete with the amount of rain that falls in the rainforest in the tropical areas where there's a lot more heat and a lot more evaporation and a lot more precipitation because of it. But take away some of that water and some of that heat, and then you end up with a deciduous forest, which is those trees that tend to lose their leaves throughout the year. And sometimes those woodlands have less trees around, right? They're more separated also than a rainforest would be, less moss all over the place, less ferns growing in the understory, more space between trees. And then if you have even less water than that, you get a temperate grassland, which we called, instead of savanna, we call it a prairie, right? Or a chaparral, which is a kind of like a shrubland with a mix of trees and shrubs. Now, even colder than that, even less warm than that, you can get a temperate desert, right? Like a cold desert. There are such on the world, like the Gobi Desert. The tropical deserts, which would be the same thing, but with more heat. You would talk about something like the Sahara Desert, right? Or the desert in Nevada, United States. It's nice, or actually, that's more of a temperate desert. The Mexico Desert would be, the Atacama Desert would be an example of another tropical one in the Americas. But the Gobi Desert in Asia, near Mongolia and northern China, that's more of a temperate one. The one in Australia, the Outback, that's an interesting one because it qualifies as temperate by region, but it's very, very hot too. So, but it's definitely a temperate desert as well. Okay, so if you get even colder, notice that so like these will be the tropical ones, right? Near the middle of the world. These will be the ones that will be found in the temperate areas, which are, between the tropics and the polar regions. So between 30 and 60 degrees latitude, generally speaking. Now, above 60 degrees latitude, when you're in the polar regions, you're going to get really, really, really cold and very, very little water throughout the year. And so you're going to have forests called boreal forests or taiga, which have thinner trees, even more spread out than deciduous forests. And that's going to be common in polar regions where there are forests. And you can also get the same kind of thing, by the way, by going up a mountain. And we'll talk about that in a second. And then even colder than that, you can get tundra, which is when it gets so cold or so dry that you can't even get a lot of tree growth. So you just have grasslands that grow very seasonally during the summer months, and during the winter months it's covered in snow when there's not even a sunlight. The sun is out sometimes 6 months throughout the year. Now, one thing that's interesting too is that if you are in a tropical area and you are climbing a mountain, as you climb the mountain, it's going to get drier and colder. So you're going to shift this way by altitude too. So if you are living in a place that's grassland, and you start climbing the mountain, you might start getting a deciduous forest, a boreal forest, and finally a tundra at the very top. So that's kind of typical. But variations in temperature and pressure is what creates all the biodiversity in the biomes of our planet. Now, not a lot of this detail is going to be in the actual content assessment, but I'd like to talk about it so you see where the diversity actually comes from. It comes from variations in things like precipitation and temperature, but there's a lot of variety in biomes in the planet. And then we call that kind of variety ecological variety, but we'll talk more about that in a second. First, like I just mentioned, the key difference that makes one biome more rich than the other is first the amount of sunlight, but you'd be surprised to find out that there's not a lot of differences in the amount of sunlight. That doesn't make a huge difference among the ones that are terrestrial. There's enough sunlight received during the summer months, even at the poles, to support tons of life. The reason that it doesn't have it is because of lack of water. The proof for that is that during the summer months in the ocean, there's an explosion of life in the poles. So sunlight isn't the limiting factor, really, that's making the polar regions be tundras and taigas with less diversity, right? It's going to be because of the water. The cold regions, you end up having less water. But nutrients matter too. Things like decomposers work slower in colder regions, and so the cycling of matter takes longer there, and so that's going to be a factor as well. But sunlight is the primary factor on the ocean, because as you go away from the areas where there's a lot of light, you're going to lose more variety. So the bottom of the ocean is going to have less diversity than the top. But then in the ocean, water is obviously not a limiting factor. It's going to be nutrients that's going to be the most limiting thing if you're talking about the surface. Of course, going down, losing sunlight, you're going to lose productivity. But near the top, nutrients is the issue. And you're going to find more nutrients near the continents, where there's runoff coming from the continents and upwelling currents coming from the bottom of the ocean carrying nutrients up. Because all of that stuff tends to fall to the bottom and decompose there. So that's where all the nutrients are. You got to wait for a current to pick that up, or you have to get it from the continent runoff. So either way, near the shorelines is where you're going to find most of the nutrient-rich water, and that's where most of the life is going to be at. Now, because coral reefs tend to happen close to the shorelines and in tropical areas with a lot of sunlight, you're going to get the most diversity of life in the oceans in coral reefs. And rain forests are the equivalent on the land. Okay, they have a lot of sunlight and a lot of water, and there's a lot of nutrients, although most of it is trapped on the trees themselves, the leaves. If you kill the trees, the soil itself is not that rich. But all of these things matter when it comes to biodiversity. So why is one more biodiverse than the other? Generally because of these things. So generally speaking, a rainforest is going to be more diverse than a tundra, but among grasslands, the more heat and water you have, the better. So savannas will be more diverse than prairies, which are more diverse than tundras, right? A tropical rainforest is more diverse than a tropical temperate rainforest. And either of those are more diverse than a tropical dry forest. It all depends, too, on the amount of nutrients, but in generally speaking, that's kind of how it works. Now, the biodiversity can be measured in a lot of different ways, okay? The first one is this idea of genetic diversity. So if you look at the amounts of breeds there are in dogs, or how many types of eye color or skin color there is in humans, how many races or breeds within a species, that's basically talking about the total number of variety that exists genetically and physiologically in the species. So the shapes and genes that the species carries among its population. Then you have the idea of species diversity, which is how much variety exists within a population that's living in the ecosystem. That's not talking about a population, though, alone, but all the populations. So it's kind of like at the community level. So genetic diversity would be at the population level, and then species diversity would be at the community level. So it's how much life exists in an ecosystem. So here's an example of that. For first community, you have 25% of each tree type. In the second community, you have 80% of the first tree type, 5% of the second and the third tree type, and 10% of the last tree type. So clearly, community one has a same number of species. So you might have a bigger equivalent species diversities by number, but then if you look at the quantity of distribution of that, you see that it's most of the species in community two are going to be like one type of life. So because of that, it's going to be less diverse. So for species diversity, what matters is the total count of types of life, and then the distribution of how much of each type there is. So if you can have 100 types of life, but if the 99% of that is one thing, that's not very diverse, right? So both things matter when you're thinking about species diversity. But in general, when you're looking at the content assessment, what you're looking for is counting the number of species that lives in a place, so long as it's not like biased towards one species only. Now, ecological diversity is what I was describing at the beginning of the video. This idea that there's a lot of different ecosystems in our planet. Now, you can talk about, for example, the United States. There's multiple ecosystems in North America, right? So you have the Great Plains with the grasslands, the prairies. You have the boreal forest in the Northeast. And you have dry forest in places like Florida. You have wet forests in Florida as well. You have deserts on the west side and mountain biomes in the Rockies, right? You have the California, which has like a very interesting Mediterranean weather kind of thing, because all the water blowing from the ocean and hitting the mountains, getting trapped, and you get a lot of precipitation in that area. So there's a lot of variety of ecosystems in our country, and that means we have ecological diversity. Now, so again, genetic diversity is diversity within a population due to the number of genes. Species diversity is diversity, and examples, by the way, of genetic diversity that you can see would be things like breeds and races. Species diversity has to do with the amount of variety of life that exists within an ecosystem at the community level. So how many types of species exists, and the distribution of those types of species. You can't have one have 99% of all the life. And at the ecosystem level or biome level, or even at biosphere level, you're talking about how many ecosystems there is. That's called ecological diversity. All right. So on our next video, we're going to talk about the next two objectives, and we're going to combine them and talk about why this biodiversity matters in the first place. I'll see you guys then.